please welcome the incredible Lindsay Roselle.
Hello. Excited to be here. I'm excited for this.
Right? I'm excited to have you because not only are you the incredible COO of Bossbabe, but you have a rich history in the world of entrepreneurship. Because we've only ever had guests that are entrepreneurs on the show. So even this morning, I'm like, is she an entrepreneur? Heck yes, you are.
Yeah.
Heck yes, you are.
Yeah.
You have is your podcast still live?
It's on hiatus right now, but we're airing it through like the back episodes through Bossbabe, and we're bringing it back. You know, it's in some iteration it's going to come back. Yeah.
And is it kind of CEO mama type content?
Yeah. So my original podcast is called Motherload, and that's there's a whole origin story that really was part of my healing and like reawakening after 2020 that birthed Motherload. And Motherload is really one of the main reasons Natalie and I connected, which was then the genesis of me getting involved in CEO Mama, which she had just started around the time I started Motherload. And I came on board to support CEO Mama. And then, we kind of we always call it like dating and entrepreneurship. It's like, you don't want to go into business with somebody or like put them in a high position in your company too quickly. So we dated for several months working together on CEO Mama. And then last fall when the COO of Bossbabe was leaving, she was like, "Hey, how about you be COO?" And I was like, "Okay, this is great. Like, let's expand how we do this together." And now, of course, a whole year later, there's all kinds of growth happening on Bossbabe and CEO Mama's front. So
yeah, congratulations. Was it October 1st, your 1 year anniversary?
Yes, it was.
There you go.
Yeah, look at you. Yeah.
Yes, I know. I did my research.
Yeah, I know it.
Well, thanks to you. You shared this all on the podcast.
Yeah.
So that was easy.
True.
That was easy. And how did you guys meet?
So I had followed Bossbabe for quite a while. Actually, the world of podcasting is so interesting because I was a big Jenna Kutcher, and I'm a big Jenna Kutcher fan. Like, I love her as a human. She's a part of CEO Mama, but I had listened to her podcast from my early entrepreneur days, like 2015, 2016, when she was just starting. She was one of, I think, the OG women in business podcasters. And when I quit my corporate job in 2014, I did Marie Forleo's B School. And I think there was only at that time, just a few voices out there, and Jenna was a big one of them. And so I listened to all her podcast episodes in those early years, like 2015, 2016, 2017. And I remember she had Natalie on her podcast talking about how Natalie had just purchased the Bossbabe business from the original founder, which is a little known story. It's super interesting, but Natalie worked for the original person who started that Instagram and ran that business for the original founder, and then eventually bought it from her and then grew it into the Bossbabe we know and love today. And so
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So cool. Yeah.
I know. Yeah. And then she brought on Danielle as her co-founder, and then they worked together for several years, and then Natalie bought Danielle out last year. But anyway, so I heard this origin story on Jenna Kutcher's podcast early on and was like, oh, this is interesting. I'm going to go follow Bossbabe and Natalie because she sounds, you can always feel like when you listen to somebody on a podcast, you're like, oh, I resonate with what she was saying. And she was talking about, being from an early age, the consummate entrepreneur, even in her teenage years, like always looking for the next idea and how to bring it to life. And so I started following her early on. And then in 2020, actually, right before, well, I guess it was right after COVID hit, the business I was running at the time, we were trying to grow an online membership, and Natalie offered a membership mastermind that at that time. And I joined that to get support growing an online membership and connected with her through that mastermind. It was a small group of us. And she had not become a mother yet at that time, but that would have been in mid 2020. So I had a 2.5-year-old, 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old basically. And that's when stuff happened in my relationship. And of course, COVID shut my businesses down and they never reopened. And so I was going through it while I was in that mastermind. And I remember her saying to me, we can talk more about what I went through at that time, but she knew what was happening in my personal life. And I told her, I can't do the homework in this mastermind. I cannot keep up and actually execute on what I'm supposed to be doing in my business right now because my personal life is collapsing and I'm just trying to survive, and I have 2 little kids, and I don't know what to do, but I've just got to be focused here. And the business, I can't do it. And she was like, I don't know what you're going through. I'm not a mother, but I know that you're so strong. And when I do become a mother, I'm going to come back and talk with you about how you managed this, because I don't know how you're keeping up. Like, you're the breadwinner, you're trying to run your businesses. At the time I had multiple businesses, and you're going through this like personal life collapse and trying to be a great mom. And you're doing all of the things. Oh my God, how are you doing it? I have no idea, you know? And then within about a year after that, she was then pregnant, and she started following me again, and we would DM. And then we've talked about this, but she had a similar birth experience where, you know, kind of an unexpected C-section, a really hard recovery from a C-section, and a big identity crisis afterwards of like, do I even want my business? Do I even want to work this hard? Like, maybe I just want to be a mom, you know, and what does just a mom mean to any of us, you know? And, so we ended up reconnecting from there, and just over DM and voice notes. And, we got on a Zoom, probably it would have been about 2 years ago this month. And I remember getting on the Zoom with her, and I was nervous because, like, you know, she's Natalie Ellis and I really respected her, but we didn't have the connection that obviously we do now. And I was like, how are you? You know, like, I know you had a tough birth, and I know that you're going through this identity stuff. And she just started crying. And she was like, the stuff that I hear you talking about with motherload, and the things that you say on your Instagram, like about how I have so much ambition, but I also want to be a devoted mother. And those two things feel so at odds. So, like, that's how I feel. And I just don't know what to do, you know? And so we just talked, and then that was the seed that kind of led to me working with her on CEO Mama. And then, you know, a short 2 years later, here we are. So
there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is such an interesting energy change when you have a child. Like, I remember when my first was born, it was like a 24-hour experience, and it was just, I was exhausted, and they put him on my chest, and I'm like waiting for this flood of emotion that I thought I was supposed to have as a mother, as a new mother. And then I just looked down, and I remember this moment so clearly, looking at his hands, and I'm like, oh my God, his hands are so big. And I look over at Matt or Dan, and he's just bawling. He takes his shirt off, and he's ready to hold the baby. And I'm like, yeah, take him, and actually don't give him back.
Yeah.
And even the nurses were kind of like off put, because I did not know what to expect. I really expected to like be just dripping in love and wanting to nurture this baby. And I'm like, oh no, I had baby blues instantly.
Yeah.
The moment he was born, for like 3 months. And it finally just came around that this is the new life that we're living with a child. And it was tough. But now, fast forward 11 months, Noah was born. And
wow. 2 back to back.
Yep. 2 babies in 1 year. Totally different experience.
Yeah.
I feel like there was like that. Now I know what this is all about. I just did this. And when they put him on my chest, I'm like, we got this, bro. We're good. But we don't know what to expect.
No.
When we're birthing these kids. And every kid's different too.
Yeah. Well,
what was it like for you?
That journey too, you know, I think especially, I assume this about you, like your ambition was there long before your motherhood, right? And I think, you know, that we see the memes, but I saw one recently that was like, why do so many ambitious women have such a hard time in matrescence, like the journey into motherhood? And it's a lot about self-sufficiency and control. And, you know, most of us who are highly ambitious are also highly independent. And we have been since we were probably teenagers, you know, like, especially if you're part of the millennial generation, like I'm 42, you know, I'm elder millennial. Like
you're old.
I started, yeah. Like, I know it's crazy now.
I'm the same age.
But I started working when I was like 15, you know, and I had business ideas before that. And my dad was an entrepreneur, and, you know, and so for me, like ambition was just, it's not just part of, like, it is my identity. I was a top student. I went to a top tier university. I overachieved in every single facet of my life you could possibly overachieve in, until I became a mother. And there's no winning at motherhood, right? Like, you aren't going to overachieve as a mother. Like, in the motherhood part, you might overachieve by doing too many other things, but like, there's no way to show up in those first few days, hours of motherhood and be like, well, I can structure and win this. Like, you can't. And I think that's the massive identity break that happens for a lot of us, is you realize in that moment, oh, wait a second, like I can't control this. And the biology hasn't kicked in yet. Like, I think it's also when you go through, especially a traumatic birth or like something you didn't, I think all birth is at some level traumatic. I mean, it is, it's a huge physical depletion on the mother's body. And so I think those initial few days and hours where your body is still replenishing itself, it's hard to feel. It can't necessarily give all of itself to the nurturing of the baby yet. And that's, as an aside, in the past, in the village structure, like that's where the aunties and the grandmas and the sisters would have been there.
Which are now called the witches.
Right. Yeah. Or witches. In my case, like the amazing doulas and the L&D nurses who were like my little village. But, I think in those early days, your biology hasn't quite kicked in yet. And so all you're there with in those first few moments with your baby is your intellect. And your intellect is going, wait a second, this is not me. Like, I don't want this thing. I can't, we don't say that out loud, right? But it's like, I don't want this change. I don't want something that I can have control over. I don't want this to change who I am. And there's this identity break of like, oh no, I can't control this. What do I do? But also an awareness of like, wait, I'm a mother. Like this is my baby and the incredibleness of it, And so I think the intellectual piece of the identity, I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist or anything, but in all the stories and my own experience and everything I've read about it, there's a lot that happens in your brain in that moment that's going, whoa, who am I?
Yeah.
And then
you're in pain and you're exhausted.
And your body's physically depleted. And, and so I think the important thing is what happens next, and in my case, I was the breadwinner at the time that I had my first son, and he wasn't planned. Like, I think that's an important aspect of my story is I had only been dating RT, who's my partner, for like less than 6 months when we got pregnant. And so, and he was 25 and I was 34. Like we're almost 90 years apart. Yeah. And so he was absolutely not and this will bear later, when we talk about relationship stuff, but he was not in the mindset of becoming a parent. Like he was 25. It wasn't intentional at all. But I said at the time, I want to keep the baby. I'm ready to have kids and I'll handle it. And, and I think some of that is also bears in our relationship too, where it wasn't a conversation of choice. It was like, I'm keeping it. And so we didn't know to prepare to become parents. Like we were just entrepreneurs and we knew we had to keep making money. And I was a consultant at the time. So I was dollars for hours. And so when I had Sawyer, our first son, in 2017, and in that initial recovery phase, I didn't really know how to treat the identity stuff because I couldn't spend time there. I had to get back to work, and I was like, well, I'll figure it out. I got to get back to work. And that ended up catching up with me by 2019 when I had my second son and headed into 2020, where now we had 2 kids and we were still entrepreneurs. I was still the breadwinner. I still was trying to manage the whole household, both kids, my relationship, a couple businesses that were all growing. Like, heading into COVID, my businesses were doing great, which also just kind of makes me sad looking back. I'm like, God, like, oh, had it not happened,
like businesses,
what would they be now? I had a brick and mortar yoga studio here in Northern Colorado, and it was thriving. And then I had a business that was an in-person mastermind company, an event company for entrepreneurial women. So we hosted huge events. Actually, like I'd done almost 100 events by the time COVID hit here in the region up here. We had in-person mastermind groups, and then we were launching in 10 other cities and online. And that was the plan in 2020, was to go to 10 other cities plus launch an online membership. And I had hired a whole team and I was coming through, my 2019 baby was almost 1. So I was like coming out of like the thick of it postpartum stage. And then COVID hit in, March of 2020 and shattered all those plans. But I think that's really when the identity stuff really started to catch up with me, was once the business, kind of the blinders of being able to focus on a business as my identity came off because the businesses went away because they were shut down. That's when I had to really look at, oh my gosh, who am I without my ambition? Who am I when my businesses, who are my whole identity, are ripped away from me and I'm left with being a mom and being myself. And neither of those things felt very good to me because I hadn't spent any time figuring myself out in those contexts. I only knew myself as an entrepreneur. And then that led to, some basically a rock bottom phase. And, which I look back on now as a magic dark. Like it was super magical in that time in terms of how I've come out of it. But going through it was hell. It was terrible.
So a couple notes on this too. You got me thinking of the have to do versus want to do. I remember so clearly when Max was, I think, 2 months old was when we were hosting our first team offsite. So I had a team of 12 and I was back to work right away. And it was the first time I was leaving for multiple days. And I was really nervous because this was now sole responsibility on my husband. and like, he didn't really know how to do everything because I had already been doing everything. So I was nervous, exhausted, but I was like, I wanted to do the retreat. I wanted to go away with my team, but I felt like I had to do the parenting. And which also got me thinking of, what did I write down? I can't even read my own. Okay. How you can't escape it. It's like if your business is going to crap and you're frustrated by it, you can just leave. You can leave the office, leave the studio, walk away. You can't just escape your child. And then the other thing that really is like the crux of this all is how much your ego wants to control everything.
Yeah.
And as soon as you start letting go of control, as soon as you start pushing that ego aside, things actually become a lot easier. But the control of the situation, you can't as a mother, especially to a newborn, is it's just everything is kind of all up in the air.
Yeah.
And I know there's women that are like, my babies sleep through the night and they feed on demand and it's perfect. And I'm like, my kids were not. They did not do that. I did not have that. They did not check that box when they were coming to the earth. Too bad. But the have versus the want to do was the thing that made me feel so guilty because I remember just being like, I have to do the parenting thing. I have to feed the child. I have to change his diapers. I have to whatever. I didn't want to do it.
Yeah. That's key.
That hurt.
No, yeah. I mean, there's so many nuances to this. Oh my gosh. I love this conversation because this is the stuff that spurred Motherload. There's so many things that I'm thinking about and having a whole conversation in my head about that no one ever saw, and I didn't feel seen in or supported in. And then expressing something like that out loud, like, I feel like I have to change diapers. I don't want to change diapers. And I mean, the backlash, geez, that you would get from like saying, especially in 2019, now, like, I think you could say stuff like that on social media or like in a peer group and people would like nod their heads and be like, I get it, girl. Like, and we're here for you because here, totally. Like, I think culture has shifted even so much in 5 years around understanding the motherload and understanding how complex and how much duality exists in motherhood, where of course I would literally die for my children any day, offer me up. Yeah. But do I like to wipe their butts? No. Do I want to go do that? No.
Some of the blessing too during the pandemic is that everyone was forced to stay home. So I think there was the other partner that finally got to see insight as to what it was like to be at home. Yeah. Like those, however it was, like 2 months, lockdowns on and off again, they actually got to see 24/7 what it was like to be around the children. So maybe there's more respect and appreciation for that.
I think so. And just, I think a collective softening of humanity where we're just like, okay, like we can all be in our experience. At least, I don't know. There's another conversation we can have, but it's like this understanding of the humanness of everyone. And I think becoming a mother helped me feel this way about other people and other mothers and their experience, where I'm like, oh, you know what? Like, we're all doing the best we can. Like, I don't agree with everything that you do. And I don't agree with how you handled that, or I wouldn't say something like that, or whatever my personal thought is about somebody else's motherhood. Becoming a mother really helped me understand that there's so much to it that ultimately, as long as you love your children and you want the best for them, any decision you're making or any situation you're grappling with, I can empathize. And we don't have to be on the same page in terms of belief systems or decisions or how we would handle something, but I can have empathy for you as a mother in wanting the best for your children and in struggling through what that means for you. and, and trying to reconcile every aspect of every single little thing all the time. And I do think COVID really helped with that. But I think there's also so much more work we can do. And it's these kind of conversations, where it's like, I love my children and I also love to work, and that feels hard, and it makes you feel, I think from an identity standpoint, it can kind of stand in the way of the identity reconciliation that we have to go through when we become mothers, because work is always there. I can always go lose myself in work if I'm running away. Like usually my tendency, at least during that time, was when something was hard in motherhood or hard in my relationship or hard in my own inner world, I would run to work and I would just go to my laptop and turn on, and like get working on something because I can lose myself in that. And our culture so insidiously rewards that, right? It's like, well, here's some success. I can raise my success flag and nobody would even question my motherhood or my relationship or my inner world.
It's also a coping mechanism.
Yeah.
Like I'll see that the patterns in my life to date where I'm like frustrated by something that's happening at home, and then I just go to work. And I feel like the sense of there's so much more control in that.
Yeah.
So listening to one of your podcasts, you share the story about this soft bottom that you hit in your relationship. And I found it so interesting. And I'm so thankful that you're open to discussing this too, because it is quite personal. But I feel like there's such a beautiful outcome to this that can be shared with the listeners. So tell us about what happened to you and your partner back in the day.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of alluded to some of the breadcrumbs of the beginning of the story. He is a lot younger than me. We are still together today. So there's a happy ending, to this story, but, and I'll explain all of that. But, he was 25 when we met and I was already in my 30s. I had worked a full corporate career, 10 years of corporate management, traveled all over the world. I had multiple businesses at the time we met. That's actually how we met. Is I had a marketing consulting company and he hired me to help with his business. And, I was just at a different life phase and I wanted to move a lot faster, and I think I pulled him along with me and didn't know that there was all this expectation setting and uncommunicated expectations that we had just never cleared, and they started to build unbeknownst to me. And because we had our first son, he was a surprise. I mean, nothing's by accident, right? Like, I mean, I know how babies are made, so I take responsibility for how we conceived him. But by the time we had our second son, we chose to have a second child because RT, my partner, is an only child, and he was born to older parents who are already in their late 30s when he was born. And so he was very adult, from when he was born. He was an only child and he was only really around adults. And so it was important, especially to him, that we had a sibling for our son. And so, I think we were both just very blinded by kind of the us against the world feeling in those first few years and it was the late 2010s, like business was booming. Like our businesses were growing a lot from 2017 to 2020. We had a lot of success and it felt, I don't want to say easy, but it did feel easy to kind of have two little kids, multiple businesses, and just keep adding. And I think it felt easy because that was the coping mechanism, like you're saying. And then in late 2019, I had a 6-month-old, our second son was born in May of 2019. So by the time he was about 6 months old, like fall 2019, 2 days apart in November, my dad and RT's mom were diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. His mom with colorectal cancer and my dad with prostate cancer. And both of us were like, okay, like, wow, we've never had been faced with the prospect of either of our parents not being here. It just isn't something you think about. And that was kind of the beginning of what I call like the turn in our relationship. And my dad chose to fight his cancer. He's scheduled for surgery. He went through, a major surgery, multiple years of treatment, and is alive to this day, God bless. And RT's mom chose not to treat hers and went into hospice and died 2 weeks before COVID hit, like early March 2020. And it's his story to tell. And I try not to like put words in his mouth, but that was the first adversity he had ever really faced in his life. He had a fairly good, quote unquote, good childhood, like parents with means. He grew up on a Christmas tree farm in Pennsylvania. He had a very nice, loving childhood. And, compared to me, like my parents got divorced. It's not a comparison game, but it's like, I feel like I was a grittier human. And so like when faced with my dad's mortality, I kind of was like, we got this, Dad, like we're going to fight, and I felt like I never worried that he wouldn't be here. But for RT, when his mom chose not to fight hers and she chose to succumb to it, I think it triggered something in him around like, how could the universe allow this? How could God let this happen? And it triggered some kind of like deeply seated resentment in him. Bitterness is what he calls it. And then right on the heels of that was COVID, which he has a manufacturing company. So the government mandated it to shut down too, which we had to fight because it's a manufacturing company. And luckily he was allowed to stay open. But it just felt like, I think one after another, like the hits just kept coming in early 2020. And, looking back now, my part of the responsibility in it was I was so lost in myself, and so I wasn't able to be a partner to what he was going through. And I think when I saw him in grief over his mother and I saw him in anger over the state of the world, I was so lost in my own experience of my own emotions around what was happening with COVID and motherhood and my own identity that I was like, I don't know, like get help, I remember feeling like I can't be the person. I'm not here to be the strong one. You need to go get help and deal with your grief. And I remember kind of putting it back on him in a way that was confronting, I think, and not as loving as it could have been. And so I think that was the initial rupture for us. And there's so much context, we've talked on other podcasts about it, but by the time the fall of 2020 came around, I had lost both my businesses, like fully closed, had to buy out of leases, like hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. I mean, it was big, major, life-altering things that had happened in just those short 6 months from when COVID had started till, September, October of 2020. And I was making decisions based on me. And so like when I closed the businesses and had to buy out of commercial leases, I just agreed to terms. I was like, I just want out. Like so I'm signing things that put us hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. And he was not in agreement with those decisions, but I was not really asking his opinion and, things like that. So, October came around of 2020 and there were so many other little things, that I could feel it coming in hindsight. I could really feel something was wrong and something was coming. So we went to couples counseling, and it was the second time that we had gone to couples counseling. And he basically just at the very end of the session, after sitting there stonewall, he said, I want to be alone. I don't want to be here anymore. Like, I don't want to be a dad. I don't want to be with you. I don't want any of this. I'm done. And obviously that was shocking and devastating because despite the issues I knew were there, that's not what you ever expect to hear your partner or the father of your children say. And, and to keep a very long story fairly short, it took a few weeks. Basically, that weekend, I made the decision within myself, and we can talk more about this because I think this is the relatable piece. I made the decision that like, I will be okay no matter what. I will figure out myself. This is an invitation within. I could sit here and blame him and write a treatise over why all of this is his fault. And I did. And I wrote it all in my journal and it still exists there today, but I never shared it. And instead I took every single one of those points and said, how did I get here? How did I let this happen? And not that
is taking a massive responsibility.
Yeah. Not that he didn't have blame, because he did, but I just knew it was like this reckoning for me of, when you hear someone say something like that to you as a mother, how do I say this? It's like, I was like, this will never happen again to me. I will never be caught in a situation where I could lose everything and it's completely out of my control. And so it like triggered something in me of this, like the survival instinct within protection of my children. It's like, I will make myself, the best version of myself. And I will make it so that I will always be okay no matter what happens. And I will always be okay as the mother of my children. And from there, I dug into what ended up being like 100. I went almost 200 days in a row. I did a practice called the dark hour, which I just made up because it started in 4 a.m. because I couldn't sleep in those initial few weeks. And so I would wake up super early before my kids, and I would do this whole ritual of prayer and meditation and a little bit of body movement. And then I would journal and just let out everything, because if I didn't let it out, it was seething inside of me. And so I have journals and journals and journals full from those 6 months or so there. And that dark hour practice for those solid 6 months was really my masterpiece of like inner work and inner evolution that got me through the really hard phase of us. And we stayed in weekly counseling, and we talked about every single thing that had ever been a resentment in the relationship that had built and never been talked about. And that was really powerful to kind of wash the slate clean. And by mid 2021, we decided to reset. And so we basically ended the old relationship, started a new relationship, and rebuilt from there. And we had a great therapist, and, I attribute a lot of it to her, and a lot of it to, we would go on a date night every night. So we went to weekly couples counseling, and then we would go out to dinner afterwards and process everything, which was really important. And then I attribute a lot of it to my ability to stay centered, like to stay in my center and not lose my patience with him, because he took a lot longer than I did to like come through it. And I remember thinking like, I just want to shake him and like, wake up. You are like, where is your heart? He was so in his ego, and he was so in his head. And I'm like,
we're already doing the work.
Yeah. And I'm like, get in your heart. Like, you have children. It's not cool to want to be the Disneyland dad. He kept saying like, I think I'll just be the Disney dad. It's fine. And I'm like, that's not cool. Like, no one respects that. And I would like, I just want to shake him. But eventually his heart cracked, and he did, EMDR. He did like a lot of confronting work. And so, and then we rebuilt, and we're still rebuilding, to be honest. I mean, here we sit 4 years later, and I won't pretend that there's not lingering little pieces of it here and there. It's like, you can clean up the glass breaks, you can clean up the big shards, but there's always like a little bit of glass dust, and like you might occasionally step on a little tiny sharp piece. That's how it feels. And
yeah, it's a great metaphor.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm proud of myself for how I handled it. And I think when I look at other women who've been through similar things, I'm like, the power to stay in your own center when something that devastating happens, and to not lose yourself in it or to blame others, I think is the secret. And it's so hard, but yeah, I'm very grateful that I found the practice. I was able to get through it, and it is a work in progress.
And it always should be, because you're both growing. And so there's different work and expectations that are required of you. I think about when Dan and I first started dating, he was a totally different person. This was like 14 years ago. And man, the person he has become, because he chose to be that person for the best good of himself, but our family as well. And even me, I notice the more that I do the work, and the work really is facing the truth that we know intuitively is the stuff that we need to change about ourselves, and just staring it straight on and going through it, where you're turning your edges inward. That is the best thing you can do for a marriage.
Yeah.
And the more that we worked on ourselves outside of any expectations of what each other wanted, we just naturally showed up as better partners.
Yeah.
And we still do this work every week. We have a weekly meeting. We go on quarterly couples retreats. We read books together. Our spiritual therapist said you have to read the book If the Buddha Married and meet on it weekly. So we'd go on our date night, and then we'd read a few chapters, and we'd highlight the things, and we talk about things. And
not me furiously writing that down. I'm like, I love this. You guys inspire me. I mean, I followed you both for a long time, and I see that work, and I'm like, this is such a good example, because we do that work now too, RT and I, and like, there was no context for that. I don't know about, how you guys learned to do it, but same, like, we only learned to do that out of out of crisis. That was crisis recovery for us initially. And now it's just a component of our weekly rhythm that helps keep our relationship healthy. But I'm like, how do people learn this without having to hit crisis first? Cause that like, wouldn't that be nice? You know?
Well, that's the thing is if they're there, just meet the other person where you're at. And what we've done, because we've been through so much as a couple, is that we do the work and the most work when things are good. Because we tend to default to getting help when things aren't going well. Why do we do that? It's kind of like we start eating well and working out when we start gaining weight, but why don't you just maintain it? Because really maintenance is easier than having to come out of something that is so deep. So when things are good, we're still working on it. We work with our spiritual therapist. I get a phone call with her every week. He gets a phone call with her the next week. And then a couple weeks later, we come together and the three of us chat.
I love that.
When things are going well and when things are going crappy, then we have that like the arbitration.
Yeah.
We have an experienced person that can mediate. And the way that she does it is so beautiful because I have such a terrible time articulating my thoughts. It's best if I write it down. So I'll be in a conversation and I'll say something and then he takes it personally and I'm like, oh, but why are you feeling that way?
Yeah.
And then Stephanie will chime in. She'll be like, I think what Renee meant to say. And I'm like, exactly. That's exactly what I meant to say. So do the work when things are good.
Yeah, that is the message. And I think that's, in us reconciling now and how we maintain it now is we're very sensitive to the things we identified as the main triggers of how we ended up there are kind of our guideposts now, where it's like, if either of us feels like we're starting to go down a path of these major things, we stop, they get brought up and we have the conversation now. And that makes for a lot of hard conversations. It sounds like you guys do that too, where it's like we make time to have hard conversations, direct conversations, which is so interesting as an entrepreneur, because when you manage a business, I'm thinking of all of us running our companies and having employees. Like, I'm so good at that. Like that's not hard for me at all in a business setting, but it's very confronting when it's somebody that you love and when there's intimacy there. And I think a lot of it comes down to like what we've already talked about, like safety and control, where you can't control what somebody else is going to think when you tell them your truth. And in your most intimate, close partnership, and also if they're the parent of your children, to potentially endanger the safety of that relationship by being honest with someone is very, very scary. And that's what keeps a lot of us silent, and I was there too. And I think that's where it is always continual work for me to say exactly what I mean and not to do it in a way that's meant to harm or blame, but just to be honest.
I'm reading the book, 5 Regrets of the Dying. Have you read that?
No, but I've heard of it. I'm going to write it down.
Oh, it's so good. And so one of the things that she says is because she worked with so many people that were on their deathbed, and we can all assume what the regrets are. It's very obvious what they are. And one of them is, I wish I didn't work so hard.
Yeah.
But the other one is, I wish I just would have told people how I felt.
Yeah.
How you feel. So I'm reading that chapter and I just felt so compelled to just text the random people that came to me and just compliment them and say why they're incredible people.
Yeah.
And here's what happens is like, sometimes it's really hard for us to give a compliment. A lot of people find it very difficult. The more you do it, the easier it gets.
Yeah.
Because it's already in you. You're just creating a platform for it. So I'll turn it in. I'll be like, hey, here's something you do I don't like. And I've been wanting to talk to you about this for 14 years.
Yeah.
Can you chew with your mouth closed? Like, let's just start there. But the more you do it, the easier it gets because, and here's what's happened. People deny speaking the truth because they're so worried of a negative outcome. And she even talks about this in the book, where she confronted a friend about something that she's been resentful towards her for a while. And this now old friend kind of retaliated and got really, really angry. And there was a whole other side of her that she never saw and cut ties with her completely. And then the author, Bronnie, I think that's how you pronounce her name, was like, well, that person was never meant to be in my life going forward, yet I clung on to that relationship because I didn't want to say the truth of my thoughts and how I was feeling. And so instead of expressing the truth, knowing very well that it could go either way, I just stayed in that muddied water.
Yeah.
And I guess the worst case scenario happened and they never spoke again. But there's also a sense of clarity and relief when those things happen.
Yeah.
And I think we have to be okay with losing people and things when we speak our truth.
Yeah. And I think, I don't know, in my experience, there's just so many, like, there's so much context for this, but like, I look at my parents, you know, and their parents and the generational stuff. And I'm like, being an adult and living, you know, in my 40s now, and I have kids, and I'm like, I can see where they weren't truthful, you know, like as children, like, and it wasn't that they were intentionally lying to us insidiously. It was like, they just didn't know the truth about themselves and they were scared to be honest with each other. And I grew up in that energy, you know, and it led to their divorce, which was extremely traumatic and all these things. And I'm like, man, there's so much understanding and beauty and like, gosh, we're just all human. And it is really scary to be honest with other humans, especially when you know it could be the end of something and it could have negative consequences on people that you love. But isn't the reason that we're all here to be in our truth. Like it doesn't feel good to anybody to hide something. And I think like the human brain literally has walls and like neurons that misfire and make you literally physically uncomfortable when you're hiding something. That's why so many of us are terrible liars, right? Because it's actually
inauthentic.
Like physically uncomfortable to lie. Our brains don't want us to do it because in primal survival, that's not safe. That's danger, right? And so I think we recognize discomfort in people and we want people to be okay. And if you're somebody who's done a lot of truth telling, especially to yourself, I think you've built new neural pathways of like, oh, the truth feels easier. The truth is easier. The truth is easier. And your brain.
We were talking about that this morning on the way to the gym because he was like on this coaching call and he can get intense sometimes, but he doesn't like the small talk. He doesn't like the BS.
Yeah.
And on his coaching calls, the floor is open for people to ask questions. And I guess it took a long time for this one person to actually get around to asking the question. And he got frustrated because he's like, you're wasting all these people's time.
Yeah.
And I guess the person didn't receive it very well and then went on social and said some comments about Dan. And then Dan's like, oh, maybe I should like tone down my whatever. And I go, no, like, that's you. And the more that you are you expressing yourself in the fullest potential, then the easier it is to remember the story. Yeah. Because when we tell ourselves lies, it's really hard to remember the truth. And then you keep circling in your head, well, oh my gosh, what really happened? Like most of our memories are actually made up.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily truth.
Right.
But make them good. Make them as truthful as possible. Okay.
Oh, that's so good. Yeah.
We should probably do a part 2 on this.
Yeah, we should. I want
to double click on the mom side of stuff too, but I do have one last question for you. When I ask you what it means to be a wild woman, what is that to you?
Oh, I love this. I have like goosebumps. For me, a lot of it, I grew up here in Colorado and I am always called back to the mountains. And one of my, most proud or like most important moments of the last several years was buying this cabin that, it's on adjacent property to property my dad has owned for 30 years since I was a kid. And he's always coveted this cabin. It's like the beautiful log cabin at the top of a mountain with insane views. And long story, but I was able to purchase it in 2022 and for our family. And it's this place where I feel like I can go and be wild, be outside, like be in the wild. And if you live somewhere or if you've ever been in the wilderness, I know you have, there's something that stirs in you when you're out in the woods. And that it's indescribable, but that's it for me. It's like, I want that feeling, but in my life all the time. Like I want to be at my edges. I want to be in that kind of like primal, optimal state of, not that I want the mountain lion to jump out at me, but if it did, I know what to do. And it's not like I'm panicking about it. I just know what to do. I'm centered. I'm ready. And I feel like humans have lost a lot of that kind of like presence and readiness because we're so numbed by dopamine and distraction all the time. But going out and being a wild woman, like it means that you are so centered and so present and so optimized and ready that no matter what comes at you, you're going to be you. Like you can tell the truth. You can hold your center. You can show up nurturing. You can show up fierce. And I get primed in that way by being out in literal nature, like in the actual wild.
Oh yeah. You can feel it in the trees, the energy of the trees, putting your feet on the earth, feeling grounded.
Yeah.
Okay. So you have some really cool things that are happening this year. So everyone needs to go and follow you, but where can people find you online?
Probably Instagram is the best for me, just at Lindsay Roselle. That's the one that only one I've been able to embrace as my elder millennial self. But I'm pretty responsive there, and I do share a lot of my life and my kind of quirky things on there. So yeah, come have a conversation.
Love it. Well, Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.